Today we're going to look at making our basic engine checks on Vanagons with Digifont. Now before we do this, there are a few special tools that we'll need. One is this engine tester here. We're going to use this to check our engine idle speed and our ignition timing. Together with this tester, we must use this voltage splitter, VW1473. If we don't use this voltage splitter, our idle speed readings will probably be incorrect. Another adapter we'll need here is this one. We're going to use this to connect our exhaust gas analyzer to the exhaust system to check our CO content. Now the last special tools that we'll need is this multimeter here together with this adapter. We're going to use these to check the current being supplied to our idle stabilizer valve. Now it's important that we use a digital meter here. We can't use an analog meter because that won't be accurate enough for what we're going to check. Now that we're familiar with some of the tools that we're going to need to do these checks, let's look at some of the things we have to do before we get started.
The engine oil must be warm. It must be at least 80 degrees centigrade. And you'll know that it's warm enough after the radiator fan has cycled one time. Make sure all electrical consumers are off. Those are things like the headlights, the rear window defogger, the blower fan, and the radiator fan. Then disconnect the hose from the crankcase breather valve and plug it. In addition, there are several other components you should check. The throttle switches, the idle stabilization valve, and the airflow sensor. Be sure you check each of them. The throttle switch must be closed at idle. You should be able to hear it click when the throttle closes. If the throttle switch needs adjustment, always refer to the repair information. Without proper adjustment, you could run into idle stabilization problems, surging at idle or at light throttle, or any other symptoms. Also, make sure that the throttle plate operates normally and that the shaft bushings aren't worn, allowing play in the throttle operation. A simple check we can include here is to check for vacuum at the hose connection for the carbon canister control valve. There must be no vacuum with the throttle closed and manifold vacuum as soon as the throttle is opened. The idle stabilization valve should vibrate and make a humming noise when the ignition switch is on.
Now, by the way, whenever you're probing electrical connectors, make sure and use a connector that fits. Don't try to use the probe from the multimeter because these are too wide. This may spread the connector and give us a poor contact. Instead, make up your own probe with a connector from the parts department that fits. Now we can check our airflow sensor by probing the appropriate terminals with our multimeter. And as long as we're talking electrical connections, we got to make sure that all our system's connections are good and tight. And don't forget to look at the system's grounds. They must be clean and tight as well.
Now, let's check how the equipment is hooked up to make our basic checks and adjustments. With the ignition switched off, connect the engine tester. Attach the tester as you would for checking ignition timing and RPM display functions, as I'm doing now. Then, take the green lead from the tester and attach it to the voltage splitter. The voltage splitter attaches to terminal 1 of the ignition coil and ground. The voltage splitter must be attached for accurate measurements. Don't leave it out. You'll also need to connect the CO meter and this special adapter hose. It's connected down here at the exhaust pipe in front of the catalytic converter. Make sure you attach it here. If you try to shortcut and hook a probe up the tailpipe, or if you use the wrong hose adapter, you could get inaccurate readings. Now, with our equipment properly hooked up, we can run through our basic checking and adjusting procedure. Always perform this procedure in the following order. First, check the ignition timing. Second, idle speed. And third, check the CO content.
Now the procedures for making these checks and adjustments are outlined in detail, both in the Repair Manual Microfiche and in this Vanagon Type 2 Pro Training Manual. Now, let's go through the steps.
For ignition timing, check it at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM with the coolant temperature sensor disconnected, and also at 3,500 RPM with the coolant temperature sensor connected. This allows you to assure that the timing is properly set and that the advanced mechanism is working. Now, with the ignition off, we're ready to make the idle speed and CO content checks. Begin by disconnecting the oxygen sensor. If you disconnect the oxygen sensor with the engine running, the ECU will store the last CO value and you won't be able to make a correct adjustment. Now we're ready to check idle speed. Connect the multimeter along with the wiring adapter to the idle stabilization valve. The multimeter will show current going to the valve. The current values must be from 410 to 450 milliamps when idle speed is at approximately 880 plus or minus 50 RPM. Always refer to the repair information for the latest specifications. If these measurements are not within specifications, adjust the idle air bypass screw.
Now, if you've got a problem with your idle speed, make sure it's not being caused by a saturated charcoal canister or an improperly routed charcoal canister hose. These things can cause a change in idle speed and not allow a correct idle setting.
If you need to make an adjustment, always follow the correct procedures. Then recheck the idle speed and the CO content and readjust them if necessary.
Now that takes us through our checking and adjustment procedures for Vanagons. Let's take a look at what some of the major points were.
Always use the proper tools and equipment. Make sure you make all of the electrical checks and make sure you check the grounds. And don't forget to check all of the components. And finally, always follow the procedures in the repair manual microfilm.
Yeah, that's pretty important. Don't try to take any shortcuts.